For some basic context before we get into this final piece, the biggest, most despicable, and most difficult to watch of all the teams we've covered, I had to remove all of my bias into this, because this story affects me on a personal level. That's right, we have saved the worst for last. Now we can get into my personal issues in the next episode, which we will, but for now, let the rampage commence. We are going way back. The date is March 15th, 1988. The St. Louis Cardinals are officially gone, relocating to a new city. Now you may be confused by this. The St. Louis Cardinals? You mean the baseball team? Nope. Since 1960, there were 2 St. Louis Cardinals teams in the city. One for baseball, another for football. To make things more confusing, they played in the same stadium and had the same colors for their jersey and logos. The only difference was that the football team's red was a darker maroon color. That's it. On this day, the St. Louis Football Cardinals were officially relocating. Their new home would be the desert sun of Phoenix, Arizona. So what was the motive? What caused the then owner, Bill Bidwill, to move the franchise after just 27 years in the city? Well, according to him, he complained that first, the current Busch Stadium, which was only 20 years old at the time, was not up to his standards. He didn't want to share the stadium with the baseball Cardinals. So, like a true grown-up, he demanded a football stadium or else. Another reason he wanted to move to Phoenix was, get this, the weather. That was an actual reason for him wanting to move the team. He also cited the poor attendance of recent years. Well, sorry Bill, but usually when your team sucks, the attendance falls. The better the team, the better the attendance usually is. And finally, he stated in his own words in a newspaper article that, we can be more competitive there. No, Bill, location does not determine how good you are. So Bill openly admitted that he did not want his team or himself in St. Louis anymore. In turn, the fans were very unhappy. They spoke loudly. Attendance took a huge nosedive. Those that did would have signs about the owner, protesting. But Bill never saw them, because he didn't go to a single game in the 1987 season. His reason? He apparently felt threatened for his safety to the point where he couldn't go to games. Sure, that makes total sense. It's the fans' fault that you're openly trashing their city. With it all being but a guarantee that they would be leaving, the attendance just kept dropping. As the city was already done with Bill and his antics, Bill, being Bill, used this as another reason to leave. Look, they don't care about the team because I told them I don't care about them. How rude! Thus, the team was gone. St. Louis was left with anger and sadness. So, the city at the time was going through some rough patches. They lost their beloved football team. It would be another 8 years until the NFL would make their way back to the Lou. If they knew what would have unfolded in the future of their city and the NFL, those 8 years would have been the golden age of football in St. Louis. The next arc brings us to the early 90s in Los Angeles. The owner of the Los Angeles Rams at the time was Miss Georgia Frontiere. She inherited the franchise after her husband's unfortunate death, being only the second woman to own an NFL franchise in the league's history. Many of the other higher executives scoffed and laughed at the thought of a woman running a team, except they didn't learn why she earned the nickname reputation of Madam Ram. She actually invested time and effort into her franchise, leading the LA Rams to a Super Bowl. But then, like all issues, one arises. The Anaheim Stadium in LA was in awful condition. It was in no way, shape, or form adequate enough for any sort of sports team, whether pro or high school club. In addition to this, the fan base was literally quitting on the franchise. They had stopped being Rams fans. Surely Georgia must have done something awful to have this kind of thing happen. They blamed her. The woman who was doing her best to help the team was the one LA fans blamed. Politicians began to withdraw support, and it was all but inevitable that LA didn't want the Rams anymore. Georgia decided to relocate the franchise to her beloved hometown, St. Louis, Missouri. After the people of LA decided they would rather be footballists than have a woman as their owner, Madame Ram moved the franchise to her hometown city in 1995. With her team in her home, she took the passion and drove it even further. She created the St. Louis Rams Foundation and sat on boards for multiple charity organizations, including United Way, Crohn's, and the Kalitos Foundation, the American Federation for AIDS Research as well, and many others. She was an owner who cared about her city because she loved it. I think this is what they call motherly love or something, but who knows. In that time frame, the Rams were getting a brand new stadium in St. Louis, the TWA Dome, right in the heart of downtown. In addition to the adjacent convention center, this revitalized the heart of downtown St. Louis, and things got even better. The Rams became good, like very good. The greatest show on turf became known as one of, if not the greatest NFL offense of all time, going on to win the Lombardi Trophy in what is described as the greatest moment in sports history by some, known as the tackle.
From the 10, probably the final play of the game. In regulation. It is caught by Dyson. Can he get in? No, he cannot. Mike Jones made the tackle. And the Rams have won the Super Bowl.
Goal line. The game is over. The game is over.
Now every Super Bowl should have an ending such as this, down on the 1 yard.
Just a few years later, the team was back in the Super Bowl against the New England Patriots, and that game was a defining moment for the NFL. When that game ended, the new Tom Brady Patriots dynasty began, and the greatest show on turf died. As the years progressed, the team fell apart, season after season of abysmal football that makes the Browns and Lions' bad seasons look decent. The difference between the Rams and those 0-16 teams is that eventually the Lions got better, as did the Browns. But the Rams, it was a constant pain. Between 2007 and 2011, they averaged 3 wins a season during that time. 3 wins per 16-game season. This, of course, led to a drop in attendance. This happens to every NFL team. But for the Rams' higher-ups and executives, it wasn't because of the team. They decided to blame the newly named Edward Jones Dome. Because apparently a 10-ish-year-old stadium is the reason a team plays good or bad. By that logic, every team should be playing at New England's Gillette Stadium. It was around this time that a truly devastating thing happened to the Rams organization and all of St. Louis. Georgia Frontiere, the woman who did everything for her team and her city, passed away on January 18, 2008, succumbing to breast cancer. This was a rough time for the fans and the city, but it was about to get worse than anyone could have ever imagined. Enter the new owner in town, Stan Kroenke. The man who got his fortune not out of rags to riches capitalism, but mainly from marrying into the Walmart family. He decided to take advantage of the fact that George's passing meant he could gain sole autonomy and control of the franchise. And thus, he did. Stan Kroenke became the head owner of the St. Louis Rams, and we are just getting started. The Edward Jones Dome, the stadium loved by Rams fans. Sure, it wasn't the prettiest or the most high-tech, but it was their home for football, and the fans took pride in their dome. The rest of the NFL and media decided for whatever reason to openly bash the stadium. despite it being well kept up and not in a complete state of disrepair. Someone had to be the punching bag, and the Edward Jones Dome was sadly that target. Built at the worst possible time in its defense, the dome was becoming more of a thing of the past. This was because of the new retractable roof stadiums with lots of glass and lots of sunlight coming in. This, combined with the darker look of the dome, made it an easy target, despite the fact that every game was completely dry with no rain, no snow, no freezing temperatures, and no excessive heat. As for sun, no need to bring a hat or sun cream because it was indoors. As mentioned in episode 1, domes have their benefits to open-air stadiums and retractable roof domes, and St. Louis, desperate for football after losing their Cardinals, made a horrible clause in the Rams' lease with the dome. In basic paraphrasing terms, this clause stated that if the dome was not rated as one of the 8 best NFL stadiums in the league, the lease could be broken up and the Rams can do something else like a new stadium or relocate. Kroenke did his homework and knew well about this clause, along with many other sporting media outlets. For many, this clause meant that once the contract was over, the Rams would move, likely back to LA, and many people thought that this was a likely option, but St. Louis did what it could, with a renovation plan in 2010 that saw many vast improvements. However, for Kroenke, it wasn't enough, with many rumors beginning to arise that he was going to relocate the franchise to Los Angeles. Kroenke publicly declared that he would keep the Rams in St. Louis. However, in early 2015, his reassurance appeared to be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. It was made public that he and his ownership group had purchased the Hollywood Park horse racing track, located in Los Angeles, with more than enough space to build a football stadium. This is where the craziness begins. The media outlets saw this as the moment the Rams were done for in St. Louis, but those in the gateway city didn't give up. They fought. Just a few weeks after this announcement was made, a local St. Louis task force was created with one simple goal in mind: keep the Rams in St. Louis. This task force went to work immediately and came up with a gorgeous stadium rendition. I will show you some snippets here. This is National Car Rental Field, a stadium with a god-awful name, but a stunning look. However, there were 3 problems that they encountered with this plan. Number 1, the stadium was located right along the Mississippi riverfront, and considering the river has a tendency to flood once every few years, people were worried that this would be a dangerous place to put a stadium, or that it would deteriorate more quickly. Number 2, the atmosphere. Sure, the new stadium was a spectacular sight and could have been a staple of the riverfront in St. Louis, but the dome was a classic gem for many people. It was not as fancy as this new stadium, but we as humans resist new changes and like to stick with the old-fashioned. 3, and most importantly, money. Simply put, there was not enough money for any sort of public contribution to the stadium. If St. Louis put a large sum of the total cost in public funds, the city would be wrecked, and the problems that the city is already facing would escalate severely. This stadium would only be a viable success if it was fully paid for by Kroenke and private donors. But he was the man who made it clear he no longer wanted the Rams to be in St. Louis. Things looked grim. But despite this, people still went to games that year. During this time, the Rams fan base grew, but not in St. Louis. A movement for the LA Rams, the same people who gave up on the Rams over 20 years ago, suddenly loved them and wanted to bring them back home. Even though the franchise originally began in Cleveland back in 1936. Kroenke and his ownership group cited the poor attendance of St. Louis as a reason for the relocation, and we'll get to that later, and how they truly didn't belong in St. Louis. And in true LA fashion, multiple instances of Georgia Frontiere being slandered and openly mocked and made fun of. It's easy to go in and single out bad apples and try to define them as the entire fan base. No matter where you go, there will always be classless fans on every team. But it was obvious Los Angeles fans were trying to right the wrongs by being wrong. It is the true embodiment of, when they go low, we go even lower. Despite the media, the NFL, Kroenke, and basically everyone laughing at the Rams as they are preparing for their departure, St. Louis reached an impasse. Go out and support the team they love? Or protest, refuse to show up as a power statement to Kroenke? The bad news is, not showing up as a protest would only fuel the relocation fire. It was a lose-lose situation, and the Rams' final home game was special. A stunning night as the Rams beat the Buccaneers in convincing fashion. As the game ended, a chant aired throughout the dome. Keep the Rams. Even though it was all but set in stone, they didn't give up. They fought. They did everything they could until the very end, when the Rams officially announced their application to relocate to Los Angeles. It was merely days later that the news everyone in St. Louis had feared, and everyone in Los Angeles was waiting for. The St. Louis Rams were now the Los Angeles Rams. Devastation hit St. Louis. As a sign of sympathy, the people of LA began to boast and trash talk and, let's be honest, harassed St. Louis by kicking them while they were down. Classless is spelled with LA, and they made it very clear they had no sympathy for the fans in St. Louis. At this point, the story usually ends, but we still have a long ways to go. I can go on and on about the endless tirade that LA fans have against St. Louis, but in order to focus on other aspects, we get to the first moment of new LA Rams, the moment football returned to Southern California. The city of St. Louis was probably laughing so hard it could be heard all the way from California, because this was the very first play of the LA Rams.
And football is back in Los Angeles for the first time since 1994. Lucky Whitehead dodged some traffic around the 10, and now he's in the clear. Goodbye. The return to Los Angeles, not so lucky for the Rams. Whitehead goes the distance.
In addition, they were also probably laughing at the pure hypocrisy that was on display. The Rams Coliseum was terrible with attendance. It got so bad people were being paid to go and watch this team. Then, as the seasons progressed, they became a Super Bowl contender. And like all bandwagon fan bases, all of a sudden, every single person and every single celebrity in the LA area was magically a Rams fan. It's the same thing with Blackhawks in the early 2010s and the Seahawks recently. Even to this day, LA fans can't seem to get over the fact that St. Louis stole their team for 20 years. But next we have to get into the last two parts of this whole story. And the first is the St. Louis aftermath. With the Rams gone, the dome was still not fully paid off. The public bonds will contribute until 2021, and Kroenke refused to pay it off or help St. Louis out at all. Millions of dollars of bonds, a drop in the bucket for Kroenke, but he refused to pay it off. Every dollar is precious to him. The people who worked at the dome and lost their jobs as a result, they had no options. As a result, things like crime went up. Homicides fluctuated exponentially. The dome became a hollow husk of what it once was. And with certain doubts and concerns, some were considering demolishing the dome. The mayor admitted that the city and the NFL were done for. He had no interest in trying again. Maybe because St. Louis learned their lesson on the league and its unapologetic corruption. And finally, we get to our last piece. Stan Kroenke himself. The longer you look into his history and actions in the past decade, the more you realize how heartless he really is. Let's go back to 2015. The news about the purchase in LA. With concerns running rampant, Kroenke became completely distant from all media. Silent Stan was clear he was not going to say anything. Then, during the relocation process, all NFL owners came together to discuss what would happen and decide if the Rams were moving or staying put. Kroenke gave a speech to persuade the owners to vote yes on the relocation of the Rams to Los Angeles. So let's break down his main talking points in this speech. First, he mentioned that the move to LA will make the Rams more profitable along with the league. Of course, because money trumps morals in the NFL, as we already know from this episode and the last one too. He also admitted before this speech that the new St. Louis Stadium, the estimated cost would have been about $1.1 billion. Kroenke and the Rams organization would cover $250 million of that, not even a fourth of the total cost, and he refused to pay a cent more. Over $400 million of that money would be paid by taxes and bonds via public money. The NFL said that the plan was unsatisfactory. Yeah, because everything to them is unsatisfactory. You could buy them a brand new Ferrari for Christmas, and they'd complain because it's colored white and not red like they wanted. Back to Kroenke's speech. He openly trashed the city he supposedly supported. The place he promised to keep the Rams, in his own words, was not strong enough to support 3 teams, he said. A struggling city, and that no team would be interested in this proposal in St. Louis, and any team who would sign this agreement would be well on the road to financial ruin, and the league would be harmed. Blaming St. Louis for the fact that they did not have the money for renovations. He even used San Diego and Oakland and cited them as better NFL cities than St. Louis. He threw an entire city under the bus and showed no remorse for it. To dig the knife even deeper, the new LA Stadium, which consists of the stadium, an NFL headquarters center, retail space, and commercial buildings, a hotel, residential units, and park space, with a total cost of nearly $5 billion. Even worse, the entire project, every nook and cranny on this project, would be privately funded. Not a single cent of public money from LA taxpayers. It shows just how biased Kroenke was, and only would have stayed in St. Louis if he was given everything for free, which literally would have made St. Louis and its financial stability collapse. Not only that, we have more. In addition to that, Kroenke's new palace will host the 56th Super Bowl in February 2020. It'll also hold the 2023 College Football National Championship. It's possible it'll also host a location for the 2026 World Cup. And worst of all, it'll be the opening and closing ceremony site for the 2028 Olympics. The man who threatened the city of St. Louis for millions will be regarded as a hero on a worldwide stage. He is just a top hat and a twirly mustache away from being a classic Bond villain. Kroenke has had a notoriety streak in sports. In addition to the Rams franchise, he owns the Colorado Rapids MLS team, the Colorado Mammoth lacrosse team, the Los Angeles Gladiators, which is an esports team, and Arsenal FC of the Premier League. And fans of every franchise do share one thing besides an owner: their hatred for their owner. Arsenal fans loathe Kroenke along with the other franchises. And we still aren't done. We haven't even reached the best part, and that's this. The worst part about everything. Not too long ago, a few years, Kroenke desired to purchase a large ranch in Texas. The price of this land was a whopping $725 million and covered over 500,000 acres, which is over half the size of Rhode Island. Unfortunately, when he acquired this land, he learned that there were some settled homeowners on it. These homeowners were all settled around a small lake. These residents were mostly retired or disabled people who relied on Social Security and disability checks just to get by. Stan decided he wanted these people off his new property, and immediately. He used the powers of eminent domain to forcefully remove these people from their longtime homes. And it led to desperation among some, and it culminated in Rick Ellis, one of those landowners, committing suicide. In his note, the first line read, "Stan, you took my home." It doesn't matter what circumstances there are. When people drive others to suicide, they are murderers, and there is zero justification for this. But even worse, nothing will happen or change. Nothing happened to Kroenke. There are some LA fans who, and keep in mind, I'm being factual and unbiased with this, they firmly believe that this suicide story is nothing more than St. Louis propaganda. From the research I have gathered, it seems that many LA fans see any bad thing about their team or city as propaganda from St. Louis. And I'm sure anything bad about St. Louis is 1000% accurate. I will finish off this story with a personal take from me. LA has lost. In an effort to bring the NFL back, they put almost 15 cities into a desperation move to make stadium deals in order to keep their team. If a team reached a disagreement with the city, the trump card was, give us what we want or we're going to LA. And the two losers were St. Louis and San Diego. But LA still loses. They are playing into Kroenke's hand. He is a villain. Deadspin writer Drew Magary said it best. But I know better. I know the bad guys win. I know that Kroenke will get his megaplex and his billions of dollars and his endless, gushing revenue streams. I know he'll be lighting hand-rolled Cubans with flaming gold ingots while the rest of us are swept away by the rising seas. And I haven't even covered everything. Everything he touches, he ruins. And I could easily give an entire episode just for him. But we must finish this. But despite this, St. Louis made the right choice. They are winning. With the recent St. Louis Blues Stanley Cup and the Cardinals always being a part of that city, St. Louis is beginning to thrive, while Los Angeles has a skyrocketing homeless population and gang crime on the rise, including drug epidemics going on. And with the XFL St. Louis Battlehawks coming soon, the good kind of football might be back in the loo. San Diego, as much as it was heartbreaking to lose the Chargers, it was the best choice for you. Oakland is in a lowest of low, but that means that the door to the highest of high is now open, and who knows where that may lead them. Los Angeles, by ruining the Rams, Chargers, Raiders, and other cities, and the NFL, it is clear that in a league of liars, Kroenke, along with your city, have lied. But despite the sins that have been committed, nothing will be done. Or at least nothing was done until now. As we conclude this episode, I have one last personal message that should be clear from all previous episodes. We have a serious problem in America that nobody knows about. And those that do know don't seem to care. Sports owners are to a point where they have more influence and power over our society than many of our politicians and government officials. We will cover more of this in our next and final episode. My name is Winn, and I leave you with this final quote. Virtue cannot be destroyed, while evil inevitably destroys itself.